Agrippa was not greatly liked in Tiberias. He treated Herod not as a king, but as a person of inferior rank. The only adult male heir of the illustrious royal house of the Hasmoneans, with which he was connected through his grandmother, the ill-fated Miriam, the boyhood comrade of Tiberius's only son, who had died young, the close friend of Tiberius's cousins, the sons of Germanicus, Caligula, and Claudius, Agrippa felt himself immeasurably superior to the Tetrarch and showed it in his bearing. He never spoke of Rome without mentioning "my friend Caligula" or "my friend Claudius." He hinted in gestures rather than words that Tiberius was living too long. Soon the Roman Empire would fall to one of his friends, and then new times would begin for him. I disliked thoroughly this Jewish aristocrat who was forever boasting of his friendships in the highest circles in Rome, who knew every turn and twist of the politics of the capital, and who was deeply involved in its intrigues. On the strength of his probable elevation to the kingship of Judea, and perhaps of entire Palestine, he had pawned his friendship against heavy loans to the future emperors, among others. In appearance, he was completely Roman. His round, fleshy face was clean-shaven. He sat at table, this Jewish princeling, toying in the Roman fashion with a polished emerald which he carried from time to time to his eye, in order to stare at the assembled company with a tired, indifferent gaze. He held himself aloof from everybody, and expressed his boredom by leaving the banquets before they were half ended. I need hardly mention that I took special note of those significant gestures, those facial expressions, which indicated his dissatisfaction with the longevity of Tiberius, and I did not fail to report them in the right quarters. No, there was no love lost between me and your Jewish king, Agrippa I, but his sister Herodias, all honor to her. What an intelligent and charming woman! She was witty, she was amusing, and she was always apologizing for her brother's boorishness. You know him, Siliarch, spoiled by the luxury of Rome. What can he find here in this forsaken province? He is bored, and when he is bored, he is irritated. I had the honor to be invited by the Tetrarch to his fortress of Machaerus in his province of Perea, beyond the Dead Sea. The occasion was one of his birthdays, which he wished to celebrate not in the capital, but at a distance, in the more select company of his family and its closer friends, among whom he now included me. Machaerus was situated on a high hill, and its mighty walls dominated the desert which rolled its desolation to the very foot of the citadel. Hard by was the frontier of Arabia, the kingdom of the Tetrarch's former father-in-law and present enemy. The enmity sprang up when Herod exchanged his first wife, the Arabian king's daughter, for Herodias. The ascent to the fortress was laborious in the extreme. For a whole day the long caravan, with its rich trappings and appointments, its camels and asses and mules, clambered up the slopes, which consisted not of sand, but of masses of rock fused together by the heat. It was as if a sea of lava had been poured out across the landscape, wiping out grass and tree. Only here and there a miserable cactus shoot issued from a fissure in the rock. The Jews had given the name of Sodom to this region, and according to their legends, it had once been a flourishing land, but God had cursed it for the sins of its inhabitants, and buried it under blazing rock and ashy sands. From the summit of the hill we could descry, far off, the refreshing green of the fat date palms, olive trees, and vineyards of Jericho, enclosing one side of the Dead Sea and losing themselves in the rich Jordan Valley. But the Dead Sea itself was sunk deep in the desert setting, like an open eye in a wild face. Once, in his own fortress, the Jewish Tetrarch threw off the mantle of Roman culture which he wore, in part at his wife's insistence, in his capital of Tiberias, and lapsed into his natural being, the true, undisciplined Asiatic tyrant. Here he maintained an Arabian harem with countless concubines, together with their men and women slaves, originally the gift of the daughter of the Arabian king. Here his life was utterly unrestrained. He did not feel the slightest embarrassment in the presence of his cultured wife or his guests. He has to live himself out, was what Herodias, clever woman of the world that she was, said to me, a good-natured smile on her lips. After a few months down there in the palace, among civilized people, and in an atmosphere of culture, he begins to feel pent up. Then he has to come up here to his barbarian stronghold. Here he can loosen all the bonds which irk him in Tiberias. He can have all the concubines he wants. A couple of days of it is enough to release the tension. He becomes calm again and able to live with civilized people. I learned on my arrival in the fortress that here in one of the prison cells, Herod was holding captive the strange fanatical figure whose name I had heard so often in Jerusalem, to wit, Yochanan the Baptist. It would have seemed that from the nature of the offense which had led to his arrest, his gross insults to Herodias, and his frantic prophecies of the evils in store for her, and for the other more general offense of his anti-religious preachings, this Yochanan could have been put to death, and yet he was treated with extraordinary leniency. Herod had indeed removed the fanatic from the wilderness near Jericho in order to decrease his influence with the hordes which visited him on the banks of the Jordan. But he wanted for nothing in his prison. He was permitted to receive visitors, that is to say, his pupils, who continued to take instruction from him in his incomprehensible lore. More than this, I learned that Yochanan was even permitted to send out messengers who preached for him throughout the country. The fact is that Herod, like every tyrant before him, was profoundly superstitious. He looked on Yochanan the Baptist as a prophet. He felt impelled to circumscribe the preacher's influence, but he had not the courage to lift up his hand against him. But Herodias interpreted this leniency as an offense to her person. In this she was correct, and she was equally correct in regarding the weakness of the Tetrarch as dangerous to the interests and security of the state. Religious blasphemy was one thing. An attack on the highest personalities of the state allowed to go unpunished brought all authority into disrepute. I was in thorough agreement with her. I made so bold as to urge this view on the Tetrarch, both as my own and as that of the Roman power. I said, even if you look on this affair as purely local, belonging entirely to the jurisdiction of the Tetrarch, we cannot ignore Rome's interest in the maintenance of civic order. Criminals, no matter what the nature of their crime, cannot remain unpunished. I took it upon myself to urge, in the name of Rome, the early carrying out of the right sentence against Yochanan the Baptist. Herodias was not the only one to thank me. Ptolemaeus was grateful for my intervention and added his plea to mine. Our words fell on deaf ears. Precisely in this matter, which affected his royal dignity and security, the Tetrarch behaved with the obstinacy of a mule. He offered the most evasive excuses. I shall wait until his popularity has decreased among the masses, so that execution of sentence will not stir up wide resentment. The absurdity of the excuse was evident in the fact that the long delay was bound to increase the popularity of the imprisoned, or rather detained, fanatic. The simple truth was this: the Tetrarch was afraid of the man. At heart, Herod was the same superstitious barbarian as the rest of his people. I was curious to see the extraordinary desert maniac who had inspired such terror in Herod, and I asked Ptolemaeus to conduct me to him. I wanted to hear, likewise, the words of the prophet. We found him in one of the cells of the keep, chained by one hand to the wall. Outside the window hole of his cell were gathered some of his followers, to whom he was addressing himself. As he talked, he gesticulated wildly with his one free hand, and when Ptolemaeus and I entered by the inner door, he paid no attention to us. Either he had failed, in the frenzy of his oratory, to notice us, or else he deliberately ignored us. I was confounded by this spectacle of free intercourse between a political prisoner and his accomplices, but I said nothing. In appearance, he was more or less what I had imagined him to be, one of the wild men I had seen so often in the temple courts, tall, unkempt, lean, his bones standing out through the skin burned almost black by sun and desert. But for all his leanness, he displayed a powerful musculature, and his build was that of a giant. He wore on his head one of the ritualistic leather boxes of the believing Jews, in which is contained a parchment with a declaration of love to their God. From time to time, the gesticulating free hand caught at the box to prevent it from tumbling out of place, for the leather strap was too short for the thick tangle of his black hair. At the bottom of his sackcloth covering hung, likewise, the regular ritualistic fringes of the Jews. His blazing eyes were turned upward to the hole, around which crowded the faces of his followers outside. When we entered, he was declaiming words which I could not understand, for they were not in the current Aramaic, with which I was now fairly familiar, but in their ancient Hebraic language, spoken by their prophets of old. Ptolemaeus, who knew both Hebrew and Aramaic, translated them for me into Latin. This, more or less, was their content. He was chosen and hidden of God before the making of the world, and he will be with God through all the eternities. He will judge the hidden deeds of men. No one will be able to conceal them from him according to his own will. I was impressed by the rhetorical style of the man, and said so to Ptolemaeus. If he were not so dangerous, I added, we could use him in one of our theatres. What is he declaiming? Those are verses from a certain book, the Book of Enoch, one of their visionaries who lived in the time of the Hasmonean kings and prophesied the coming of the Messiah. The book has been a pernicious influence. It has unhinged thousands of Jews. Listen! The fanatic continued to declaim, ignoring the sound of our voices as he had ignored our presence, and addressing himself exclusively to the faces about the window. In that day I perceive the well of righteousness, and all are drinking therefrom. Before the sun and the heavenly signs were created, before the stars of heaven were fashioned, his name had already been pronounced by the Lord. He shall be a staff of support to all the righteous, that they may lean upon him and not fall. The Son of Man, whom thou seest, lifteth from their thrones and their places of power the kings and the men of might. He thrusteth the kings from their thrones and from their kingdoms. Their dwelling place shall be darkness, and they shall make their marriage bed with worms. When Ptolemaeus had translated these words, I protested. But this is contumacy in the highest degree. This is incitement against the emperor, the senate, and the world power of Rome. That is why we have imprisoned him. But what sort of imprisonment is this? Do you always admit the followers of a political prisoner to his cell, so that he may continue to spread his dangerous agitation? Look, not only can he preach to them, he can obtain all the information he needs from the outside world. So it is, unfortunately. He not only receives information, he sends out his messengers and apostles to all parts of the country. But in Jupiter's name, what sort of government have you? Syliarch, we can do nothing against him. Whenever the Tetrarch hears that voice from the cell, he trembles like a child. You have spoken with him. You have seen for yourself. If there is no other way, I answered firmly, I shall have to ask for the intervention of the proconsul in Antioch. You know that we are reluctant to interfere in the internal affairs of the Tetrarch, but if you have not the courage to safeguard the security of the land, others will have to supply it for you.